My father's pill organizer had 11 extra doses of his anxiety medication missing in a 6-week span, and I'm a hospital pharmacist, which means I'm one of the only people in my family who would have noticed that discrepancy at all, let alone understood exactly what it meant. By the time I finished counting, I understood my stepmother wasn't managing my father's health. She was engineering his decline, one carefully timed dose at a time, and she'd nearly gotten away with it before I ever thought to open that organizer and actually count. My name is Foster Wynn. I'm 40 years old. I've worked as a hospital pharmacist in Pittsburgh for 14 years. And for the better part of a year, I watched my father get quietly, deliberately drugged into appearing considerably less capable than the sharp, steady man who raised me, by a woman he trusted enough to marry 3 years after burying my mother. Let me back up, because you need to understand my father before you understand exactly how far someone had to go to make him look like someone he wasn't. Roland Wynn spent 38 years as a plant engineer at a steel fabrication facility outside Pittsburgh. The kind of methodical, detail-oriented career that shapes a man's entire approach to life. And my father brought that same careful precision to everything he did outside of work as well. He balanced his checkbook by hand well into his 70s, not out of any distrust of modern banking, simply because he found the ritual of it satisfying. He still solved the newspaper crossword every morning in ink, a small, deliberate flex he'd maintained since I was a boy, and he could recite, without hesitation, the specifications of machinery he hadn't worked on in over a decade. My father was, right up until 18 months before this story began, one of the sharpest 74-year-old men I have ever personally known, and I want that established clearly before I tell you what someone eventually convinced a small circle of professionals to believe about him instead. I grew up watching my father apply that same precision to fatherhood in his own understated way. He never raised his voice that I can recall, never needed to, because he had a particular gift for asking exactly the right question at exactly the right moment to make Bridget or me arrive at our own better judgment, rather than simply being told what it was. When I was 17 and wrecked my first car taking a curve too fast, he didn't yell. He sat with me in the driveway looking at the crumpled fender for a long while, and then asked, quietly, what I thought the car had been trying to tell me about how I was driving that night. I've carried that particular teaching style into my own parenting, and I've thought about it constantly over the past year, turning over the specific cruelty of watching a man who taught patience and careful observation to 2 children get systematically robbed of his own capacity to observe anything clearly at all. My mother, Cheryl, died 6 years ago after a 2-year fight with pancreatic cancer, and I watched my father grieve her with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything else, slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush a process he seemed to understand instinctively couldn't be rushed. He was alone for nearly 3 years after her death, and I'll admit, my sister Bridget and I both worried about that isolation considerably more than we ever fully expressed to him directly. So when he told us, a little sheepishly, that he'd met someone at a community center pottery class he'd started attending mostly to fill his Tuesday evenings, Bridget and I were, if I'm honest, genuinely relieved. Marisol was 58 when she and my father met, 16 years younger than him, a divorced woman who worked as an interior design consultant and carried herself with a polish and warmth that charmed nearly everyone in our extended family within the first several encounters. I want to be fair here, because I spent a long time second-guessing my own initial impressions once everything came apart. Marisol was genuinely good company in those early years, attentive to my father in ways that visibly lifted something in him, ways that made Bridget and me quietly grateful, even as some small, unexamined part of both of us noted the pace of things. Engaged within 8 months of meeting, married within 14. We told ourselves that was simply what love looked like for 2 people who understood, at their age, exactly how much time they didn't have to waste. I remember the wedding itself clearly, a small ceremony at a botanical garden my father chose specifically because Marisol had mentioned, offhand, once, that she'd always loved greenhouses. He'd remembered that detail from a conversation months earlier, and built an entire wedding around it without telling her why until the ceremony itself. A small, characteristic gesture of the same careful attentiveness he'd always brought to my mother, and I remember standing in that greenhouse watching him look at Marisol with genuine, unguarded happiness, thinking at the time that whatever reservations I still privately carried about the pace of things, I was watching a man who deserved Exactly this kind of second chance after everything grief had taken from him. I've thought about that wedding a great deal since, turning over how completely Marisol's performance of love matched, in every visible way, the real thing, and how little that visible performance apparently had to do with what she was actually planning underneath it. The first 18 months of their marriage passed without any particular incident, and I want to be honest that my guard, such as it was, had fully relaxed by the time things actually started shifting. My father seemed happy. He and Marisol traveled, redecorated the house my mother had once filled, built what looked, from the outside, like a genuinely contented second act. I didn't notice the beginning of the change because there wasn't a dramatic beginning to notice. It arrived the way these things usually do, in small, easily dismissed increments that only assemble themselves into a pattern once you're forced to look backward at all of them together. I started noticing something was off during a Sunday dinner roughly 8 months ago, the kind of ordinary family gathering that had become a reliable monthly rhythm since the wedding. My father seemed unusually foggy that particular evening, repeating a question about my daughter's school schedule twice within 20 minutes, uncharacteristically slow to follow the thread of conversation about a home renovation project he'd normally have opinions about within seconds. I remember exchanging a glance with Bridget across the table, both of us registering the same small, uneasy flicker without either of us saying anything out loud yet. Marisol, I noticed, watched that exchange too, and smoothly redirected the conversation before either of us could ask my father directly whether he was feeling all right. That fogginess became a pattern I started tracking, at first without fully realizing I was tracking it. The specific professional habit of a pharmacist who spent 14 years noticing exactly how medications interact with a person's presentation over time. My father seemed sharp, entirely himself. On most ordinary days I saw him. But on specific occasions, family dinners, a meeting with his financial advisor Marisol had scheduled, a follow-up appointment with his primary care physician, he arrived noticeably foggier, slower, occasionally repeating himself in ways that felt, once I started paying closer attention, considerably more pronounced than ordinary age-related forgetfulness. I began keeping a private mental log, dates and contexts, not yet suspecting anything as deliberate as what I'd eventually uncover, mostly just trying, as a concerned son and a healthcare professional, to understand whether something medically significant might genuinely be developing. The escalation, once it began in earnest, moved considerably faster than I expected. Marisol called a family meeting roughly 6 months ago, gathering Bridget, myself, and our respective spouses at my father's house on a Saturday afternoon, my father present, but noticeably quiet throughout, deferring to Marisol with a passivity I'd never once witnessed from him in 40 years of being his son. Marisol explained, gently, carefully, that she'd grown increasingly concerned about Roland's cognitive health over recent months, described a pattern of confusion and memory lapses that, hearing it summarized aloud in her careful, worried voice, sounded considerably more alarming than the intermittent fogginess I'd been separately tracking. I remember sitting at that table watching her deliver that summary, watching my father's face as she spoke, a specific quiet discomfort moving across it that I initially read as embarrassment of being discussed so clinically in front of his own children, and that I understand now in hindsight was probably something closer to genuine confusion, a man trying and failing to locate the specific memories Marisol was describing, memories that existed, apparently, mostly in the careful narrative she constructed rather than in any version of events he could actually access himself. Bridget's husband asked, at one point, whether Dad had seen his regular physician about any of this, a reasonable question that Marisol answered smoothly, explaining that she'd wanted a specialized cognitive assessment rather than a general checkup, that she'd already done research and found someone she trusted completely to handle something this sensitive. She told us she'd arranged for a cognitive wellness evaluation, a private assessment she'd scheduled with a consultant named Nadia Frost, someone Marisol described as specializing in exactly this kind of early-stage evaluation for aging clients. I want to explain something about Nadia Frost's credentials, because it matters enormously to everything that followed. Nadia Frost was not a neurologist. She held a certification in what her own marketing materials described as cognitive wellness consulting, a credential considerably lighter than the rigorous neuropsychological evaluation a genuine dementia assessment actually requires. and her evaluation methodology, I'd later learn, relied heavily on family-reported history, rather than the kind of standardized cognitive testing a board-certified neurologist would have insisted on. Marisol had chosen her specifically, I came to understand much later, precisely because her assessment process left considerable room for a family member's narrative to shape the outcome, and because her report, however clinically thin, still carried enough professional weight on paper to support a guardianship petition if it came to that. The evaluation happened on a Thursday afternoon, a date and time Marisol had selected and coordinated entirely herself, and my father, according to what Bridget and I pieced together afterward, arrived at that appointment considerably foggier than his ordinary baseline, foggy enough that Nadia Frost's report, when it eventually surfaced, documented significant confusion, disorientation time, and difficulty completing basic sequential tasks, findings that, taken at face value, painted a picture of meaningful cognitive decline. I didn't see that report immediately. Marisol didn't share it with Bridget or me until nearly 2 months after the evaluation itself, and by the time she did, she'd already begun quietly consulting an estate attorney about what she described to us as getting ahead of things, just in case. Language that struck me, even then, as considerably more purposeful than the casual concern she was presenting it with. I want to walk through the moment everything actually started coming into focus for me, because it began with something almost embarrassingly mundane. I stopped by my father's house on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, mostly just to drop off a book I'd promised him weeks earlier, and found him alone, sharp, entirely lucid, working through the newspaper crossword and ink at the kitchen table exactly the way he had every morning of my adult life. We talked for nearly an hour, easily, his memory and wit entirely intact, and I remember driving home afterward turning that visit over in my mind, unable to reconcile the man I'd just spent an hour with against the alarming picture Marisol had painted at that family meeting 6 weeks earlier. That unease sent me back to something considerably more concrete than a gut feeling. My father kept his medications organized in a weekly pill organizer, a habit he'd maintained since my mother's illness years earlier, and Marisol had taken over refilling that organizer sometime after their marriage, a division of labor that had seemed, at the time, like an ordinary act of caretaking rather than anything worth scrutinizing. I offered, on a subsequent visit, to help refill it myself, mostly out of simple filial habit, and while doing so, out of professional reflex more than active suspicion, I found myself counting his remaining supply of lorazepam against what his prescription bottle's fill date and dosage instructions should have accounted for. I remember that specific evening with unusual clarity, sitting at my father's kitchen table with his prescription bottles lined up in front of me, doing the kind of routine mental arithmetic I performed dozens of times a week at the hospital pharmacy without a second thought, and feeling something cold settle into my stomach as the numbers refused to reconcile, no matter how many times I recalculated them. My father was in the next room, watching a baseball game, entirely unaware that his own son was sitting at his kitchen table running the same kind of discrepancy check I normally reserve for suspected aversion cases at work. Except this time the patient whose medication didn't add up correctly was the man who taught me to ride a bike. The math didn't work. His prescription called for a low, as-needed dose intended for occasional anxiety management, no more than a few doses per week according to his physician's instructions. But the pill count showed considerably more had been dispensed from that bottle than his ordinary use pattern should have produced, and, cross-referencing the dates against my private mental log of his foggiest days, I found something that made my stomach drop entirely. The days he'd seemed most confused, most uncharacteristically foggy, lined up, with unsettling consistency, against the days immediately following what would have been additional, unaccounted for doses of sedating medication he wasn't supposed to be taking that frequently at all. I sat there a long while after finishing the count, listening to the muffled sound of the ballgame from the other room, understanding that whatever I did next was going to change something in my family that could never fully be undone, regardless of what I eventually found. I didn't confront anyone immediately. I want to explain why, because I know it might read as hesitation rather than strategy. I'm a pharmacist, not an investigator, and I understood enough about how serious an accusation like this actually was to know I needed considerably more than a pill count discrepancy and a private hunch before I said anything out loud to my father, to Bridget, or to Marisol herself. I needed a professional, credible medical evaluation of my father conducted under conditions nobody could argue had been manipulated, and I needed to understand exactly how deliberate the medication pattern actually was before I accused anyone of anything. I called Bridget that same evening and laid out everything I'd found. My sister, a middle school teacher with considerably less patience for ambiguity than I sometimes carry into situations like this, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Foster, are you telling me you think Marisol has been drugging Dad on purpose?" I told her I didn't know yet, not with certainty, but that the pattern was disturbing enough that I intended to find out properly rather than simply hoping I was wrong. "What do you need from me?" she asked, and I told her exactly what I'd already started planning. We needed our father evaluated by an actual neurologist, someone with no connection to Marisol's chosen consultant, under conditions we controlled directly, and we needed it to happen soon, before whatever legal process Marisol had already quietly set in motion moved any further forward. I want to describe the week that followed, because it required a particular kind of careful, deliberate management that felt professionally closer to the medication reconciliation work I do at the hospital than anything I'd ever expected to apply to my own family. I proposed, casually, to Marisol, that I take over managing my father's weekly medications for a stretch, framing it as wanting to spend more hands-on time helping with his care, a request she couldn't easily refuse without raising suspicion of her own. For the following 7 days, I personally filled his organizer myself, exactly to his physician's actual prescribed instructions, no more, no less, and I watched, with a mixture of relief and rising fury, my father's fogginess evaporate almost entirely within 4 days, replaced by the same sharp, steady man I'd always known. I documented that week carefully, almost obsessively, keeping a private journal of his presentation each day, small notes about his crossword completion times, the clarity of our conversations, his recall of details from earlier in the week, building, without fully articulating it to myself at the time, exactly the kind of controlled baseline comparison a clinical researcher might construct. By day 3, watching him solve the Thursday crossword, notoriously harder than earlier in the week, in under 20 minutes, faster than I'd seen him manage it in months, I had to step into the bathroom and simply stand there for a minute, hands braced against the sink, absorbing the specific, complicated wave of relief and rage moving through me simultaneously. Relief, because the man I loved was still entirely himself underneath whatever had been happening to him. Rage, because someone he trusted completely had apparently spent months manufacturing evidence to convince the world otherwise. I scheduled an independent neuropsychological evaluation for him during that same window with a board-certified neurologist named Dr. Preshabat, who specialized specifically in geriatric cognitive assessment, someone Bridget found through her own research, entirely disconnected from Marisol's original consultant or anyone in her network. I drove my father to that appointment myself, on a morning I'd made certain fell within my own medication management week rather than Marisol's, and I sat in the waiting room for nearly 3 hours while Dr. Bott ran him through a comprehensive battery of standardized cognitive testing. The real version of the evaluation Nadia Frost's much thinner assessment had only superficially resembled. I remember that waiting room vividly, the specific suspended anxiety of sitting somewhere for 3 hours with genuinely no idea which version of the news I was about to receive, flipping through a magazine I couldn't focus on, checking my phone for a text that wasn't going to arrive until the appointment itself concluded. Dr. Bott came out herself at the end, rather than sending a nurse, which I understood later was her own quiet signal that the news was significant enough to warrant delivering personally. She sat down across from me in the waiting room and said, without preamble, that my father had performed exceptionally well across every domain she'd tested, that whatever had prompted the referral, she saw no clinical evidence whatsoever supporting a diagnosis of cognitive decline. I asked her, carefully, whether medication could produce the kind of symptoms that might have been observed elsewhere. She looked at me for a long moment and said that certain sedating medications, administered outside their prescribed frequency, absolutely could produce exactly that presentation, and that she'd be glad to document that possibility formally if it became relevant to anything I was dealing with. I told her it likely would. Dr. Bott's findings, when they came back the following week in full written form, were unambiguous. My father's cognitive function fell entirely within normal range for his age. No evidence of dementia, no evidence of meaningful cognitive decline, full orientation, intact executive function, memory performance consistent with a healthy 74-year-old. Reading that report, I felt something in my chest finally settle after months of low-grade, unnamed dread, immediately followed by a considerably colder anger at exactly how close Marisol had apparently come to building an entire guardianship case around a version of my father that had never actually existed outside the specific engineered conditions she created for him to be evaluated under. I want to tell you about the second discovery because it arrived almost by accident, the way these things so often do, and it changed the entire shape of what I understood myself to be dealing with. My niece's 5th birthday was approaching that same month, and Bridget wanted to set up a shared family photo album for everyone to contribute pictures to, using an account linked to a tablet my father kept in his kitchen for exactly this kind of family photo sharing. I was helping him set up the app one afternoon, entirely unrelated to anything I'd been investigating, when a notification banner slid across the top of the screen from a messaging app one didn't recognize as one my father used. A message preview visible for just a few seconds before the screen returned to the photo app. The preview showed a name I didn't recognize, Callum, and a message fragment that made my hands go still on the tablet. Once the guardianship's finalized, we won't have to keep sneaking around like this. I sat with that fragment a long moment. My father in the next room, entirely unaware of what had just crossed his own kitchen tablet. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically cold, that the messaging app had synced accidentally, some shared cloud account setting neither Marisol nor I had apparently anticipated, exposing a conversation she'd clearly never intended anyone else to see. My hands were shaking slightly. I remember as I photographed the notification before it disappeared, and I remember the specific, surreal quality of hearing my father's voice from the next room, cheerfully asking whether I wanted a cup of coffee before I headed out, completely unaware that I just watched, in a single accidental notification, the outline of a plan that involved erasing his own legal capacity to manage his life. I told him yes, coffee sounded good, and I sat with him at that same kitchen table for another 20 minutes, making ordinary conversation about my niece's upcoming birthday party, my mind running in an entirely separate track underneath the surface the entire time, already working through what I needed to do next and in what order. I didn't touch anything further that day. I photographed the notification banner with my own phone before it disappeared. A single piece of evidence I understood immediately might matter considerably more than I could fully process in that moment. And I finished setting up the photo album for my niece's birthday with a composure I did not remotely feel underneath it. I brought that photograph to Bridget that same evening, and together, working carefully, and, I want to be honest, somewhat uncomfortably given the ethical questions involved, we consulted our attorney about what could legitimately be pursued from there. Harold Vance, the estate attorney Bridget had retained the week we started this entire investigation, listened to everything, the pill count discrepancy, Dr. Bott's evaluation, the notification banner, and set down his pen with the specific gravity of a man who understood exactly how serious a case this had just become. This isn't just a contested guardianship petition anymore, he told us. Depending on what a formal investigation turns up, this could constitute elder abuse through medication tampering, alongside a guardianship petition built on evidence obtained under manipulated conditions. I want to bring in a private investigator before we do anything else, someone who can properly document the affair through legitimate means, because a single accidental notification, however revealing, isn't going to hold up as cleanly as a fully documented pattern. The investigator Harold brought in, a methodical, unflashy woman named Priscilla Aldwin, spent the following 3 weeks building exactly that pattern, discovering, through entirely legal surveillance and public record research, that Callum Draper, a personal trainer Marisol had been seeing at her gym for the better part of a year, had been meeting her regularly at a rented apartment across town, a relationship that had apparently begun not long after her and my father's second wedding anniversary. Priscilla's report, combined with additional messages recovered through the same accidentally synced account once Harold obtained proper legal authorization to review it, painted a picture considerably more calculated than even the affair itself suggested. Marisol and Callum had discussed, across dozens of messages, the guardianship timeline explicitly, Marisol describing specific dates when Nadia Frost's evaluation would be scheduled, specific plans to adjust my father's medication to help him relax before the appointment. Language that, read in full context, left no reasonable room for interpreting the medication changes as anything other than deliberate. I want to describe the day we finally brought all of this to my father, because it remains, even now, one of the hardest afternoons of my adult life, considerably harder in some ways than watching my mother's illness progress 6 years earlier, because at least that grief had never come wrapped in betrayal. Bridget and I sat with him at his kitchen table, the same table where I found him working his crossword in ink the day everything first started coming into focus, and we laid out the evidence slowly, carefully, watching his face move through disbelief, then confusion, then a specific, devastating grief that I don't think either of us was fully prepared to witness in a man who had always, our entire lives, presented himself as steady and unshakable. "She's been giving me extra doses," he said slowly, working through it out loud. The particular processing of a sharp, methodical mind confronting a betrayal it hadn't been built to anticipate. On purpose, before the appointments. I confirmed it as gently as I knew how. He was quiet a long time, staring at his own hands on the table, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness I'd rarely heard from him, even during my mother's illness. "I trusted her completely, Foster. I let her handle things I should have paid closer attention to myself, because I thought that was what a good marriage looked like at this age, letting someone else carry some of the weight." I told him that trusting his wife wasn't a failure here. Her deliberate exploitation of that trust was. The confrontation with Marisol happened at Harold's office the following week, a meeting she arrived at apparently still believing she was there to discuss guardianship logistics rather than face the collapse of the entire plan. I watched my father's face throughout that meeting, steady in a way I found genuinely remarkable given everything he'd learned only days earlier, as Harold laid out the evidence methodically, the pill count discrepancy, Dr. Bott's evaluation directly contradicting Nadia Frost's report, and finally, the messages between Marisol and Callum, read aloud in a conference room considerably smaller than the scale of what they revealed. Marisol walked into that room in a tailored blazer, composed, professional, clearly prepared to discuss whatever guardianship logistics she believed the meeting was actually about, and I watched her scan the room, registering, a half-second too late, that Bridget and I were both present alongside my father and Harold, a configuration that visibly recalibrated something behind her eyes even before Harold said a single word. She sat down across from my father with a careful, practiced warmth, reaching once to touch his hand, a gesture he withdrew from with a quiet, deliberate firmness that seemed to register with her more than anything said out loud so far. Marisol's composure held for perhaps the first 2 minutes, a careful, practiced denial forming on her face before Harold slid the printed message log across the table. Her own words in front of her, undeniable. "Once the guardianship's finalized, we won't have to keep sneaking around like this." She stared at that line a long moment, and I watched something in her finally, completely give way, the specific collapse of a person who understands, in real time, that every carefully constructed piece of a plan has just been laid bare in front of the one person she needed it to remain hidden from most. "Roland, I can explain," she started, and my father, who had said almost nothing through the entire meeting up to that point, finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a steadiness that filled that small conference room completely. "You drugged me, Marisol." Deliberately, repeatedly, so a stranger could tell a courtroom I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs, while you were planning a future with another man on the other side of that guardianship. I don't need you to explain that. I need you to understand that I heard every word of what my son and daughter just read out loud, clearly, without a single moment of confusion, because that's who I actually am, and it's who I've been the entire time you were telling everyone otherwise. I want to be honest about what happened in the months that followed, because it wasn't the clean, immediate resolution people sometimes hope for. The guardianship petition was formally withdrawn and dismissed within weeks. Dr. Bott's independent evaluation entered into the record alongside Priscilla's investigative findings, effectively ending any possibility Marisol had of reviving the case. My father filed for divorce shortly after, and their prenuptial agreement, drafted at Bridget's quiet insistence before the wedding despite some initial resistance from my father at the time, protected the bulk of his assets from any claim Marisol might otherwise have attempted. The medication tampering itself was referred to county prosecutors as a case of elder abuse. And while the resulting legal process moved considerably slower than any of us would have liked, Marisol ultimately accepted a plea agreement involving probation, mandatory reporting to Adult Protective Services for a period of years, and a permanent restraining order barring her from any future contact with my father. My father spent a difficult several months after the divorce finalized, grieving not just the marriage itself, but the specific, painful recalibration of trusting his own judgment again after discovering how thoroughly it had been exploited. He told me once, sitting on his back porch on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, roughly a year after everything came apart, that the hardest part wasn't the guardianship petition or even the medication itself. It was realizing he'd spent months doubting his own mind, genuinely wondering, during the worst of the fog, whether Marisol's account of his decline might actually be true, whether he was losing something he couldn't fully perceive himself losing. That's the part one don't think I'll ever fully get over, he told me. Not what she did to my body, what she nearly convinced me to believe about my own mind. He's doing well now, genuinely well, back to his crossword in ink every morning, back to reciting decades-old machinery specifications with total, effortless recall, back to being exactly the sharp, steady man I've known my entire life. He started seeing a therapist a few months ago, his own idea, something he told me he'd never once considered necessary before all of this. And he's spoken a few times about how strange it feels to need help processing a betrayal at 74 years old, after a lifetime of assuming that particular vulnerability belonged to younger people navigating messier lives than his own careful, methodical one had ever been. He asked me once, a few months into that therapy, whether I thought he should have seen it coming sooner, whether some part of him had simply chosen not to look too closely at the pace of things because he'd wanted so badly for the second chance to be real. I told him I didn't think wanting something to be real was the same as being foolish for believing it might be, and that the specific cruelty of what Marisol did wasn't that she exploited an old man's poor judgment, but that she exploited a fundamentally decent man's willingness to trust someone he loved. He sat with that for a while, out on the porch, watching the yard go dim in the early evening light, and eventually said that he thought he could live with that version of the story better than the one where he'd simply been careless. I told him it was the true version, not just a kinder one, and I meant it. I still keep my own private log of his good days now, though for entirely different reasons than before, small notes about crossword times and conversations, and the specific ordinary sharpness of a man who very nearly had his own mind taken from him on paper, if not in fact, by someone who understood exactly how thin the line can be between genuine care and calculated harm, and who was willing to erase that line entirely for settlement she never got the chance to collect. I check his pill organizer myself every single week now, not out of lingering suspicion, but because counting those pills is the thing that first told me the truth when nothing else had, and I've decided that particular habit, born out of the worst discovery of my adult life, is one I intend to keep for as long as he needs me to.